Hi, I'm Mollie Ziegler Hemingway. I write about religion for getreligion.org and Ricochet.com, and I'm here with
Amy Sullivan. I'm a contributing writer at Time Magazine, where I write about religion and politics.
But today we're going to talk about sex. Is that right? Oh, wait. I got confused. Okay, so we're going to talk... right, if it gets good. Okay, so we're going to talk about various religion and political issues that are in the news. I just got off a boat for a week. I was on a cruise.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, my first ever cruise. I think there are people who are cruise people, and there are people who are not cruise people, and I think I fall in the latter camp. And I have reverse seasickness. So I was basically fine on the boat, and now I feel like the earth is moving dramatically. So if I sway during this, that's what's going on. But anyway, so let's. But my point is, I've been on a boat, so I'm like. Well, you know, I did a crash course in reading many newspapers the last couple of days, because nothing makes you want to read the news rigorously like being on a boat with a bad internet connection for a week. But so I think I'm caught up here. But anyway, one of the things that happened while I was on the boat was something to do with Plan B. Maybe you can fill us in on the details there.
Yes. So this has been a debate actually in the works for about 8 years, whether Plan B, which has been approved by the FDA and is used as kind of emergency contraception after having unprotected sex by women, whether it should be available to women of all ages and whether it should be available over the counter. Now, I think it's important to note that those are two separate questions, but they were both addressed by HHS last week. It was kind of unusual because the head of the FDA had recommended that Plan B be made available to women even under the age of 18 and be made available over the counter. So you don't have to have a prescription and you don't have to go up and ask the pharmacist for it. Currently, you don't have to have a prescription at all, but you do have to go to a pharmacy and you have to ask the pharmacist to give it to you. In what is apparently the first time ever that an HHS secretary has overruled the head of the FDA, Kathleen Sebelius last week released a letter saying that they were not going to make it available, and it was not going to be made available over the counter. This has definitely, as you might imagine, upset a lot of abortion rights groups. And one Sebelius, a small, quiet kudos from the corners of pro-life activists who have been after her over the last few years. But it has mostly raised the question, particularly among people who are upset about it, of whether this is a matter of politics trumping science. And that has been the cry that has gone.
Yeah, I was actually surprised that people were surprised by this ruling. I know that Kathleen Sebelius is pretty hardcore, but the idea that in a campaign year you would have, an over-the-counter abortifacient available to 11-year-olds without any doctor's, involvement or any parental involvement, that just seems like it's asking for a bunch of attack ads that would deliver voters into the hands of Republicans. So I was kind of surprised that people expected it to go the other way. What am I missing about that?
Well, two things. One is that I do think it's important to separate the two. I think it would have been completely valid scientifically and politically for HHS to say on the over-the-counter question, we are going to make this available so that if you're a 25-year-old woman and you need this at 11 p.m. on a Saturday night, you can walk into a CVS and get it. There would be nothing stopping them from imposing age limits, like say there are on buying cigarettes or on alcohol. And if people say, oh, well, it's pretty easy to get around those, you could make the penalties for selling to a woman who's under 18 strict enough that people basically have to comply with that. I think that was what was upsetting a lot of women, and that this was kind of a paternalistic decision requiring them to continue to go to pharmacists to ask for something that they thought should be just available to them and to women of age over the counter. The problem is that it got rolled into letting it be available to women of all ages, and that was kind of part of the battle cry that went up after the decision was made. And so I think even a lot of abortion rights supporters themselves have now gotten riled up on, trying to insist that, in fact, 11-year-olds should have access to this, and that for Obama to say that he was, made queasy by the idea that his daughters could just walk into a pharmacy and get this, they thought was politics. And I'd be interested to hear your thought, because my initial reaction was kind of, there's politics, and then there's kind of common sense and thinking about the morality of decisions. And
didn't he used that phrase too, like common sense. Mm-hmm. I don't really know. I mean, I don't really know what to think about it. I just think that the fact that it would have been a political disaster mm-hmm. for Democrats during an administration that's already been pretty tough for the pro-life Dems and for openness to pro-lifers in the Democratic Party, it just seems like a no-brainer to me. But I also think, of course, people who are pro-choice in general might look at a scenario like this and say, well, still, we don't think over-the-counter without any involvement from anybody is a good idea for an 11-year-old who, finds herself in a rough spot or something. You don't need to be pro-life to have a problem with that.
Right. And that's where I think the two decisions being melded together are a problem for abortion rights groups. Right. Because it's both an image problem, but also for them, they have gotten themselves riled up to oppose both decisions, not making that distinction.
I also was reading something last night that was interesting about a potential crony capitalism angle. I don't know if that's quite the right term for it in this case, but some people are upset that Planned Parenthood Federation of America didn't do more. Some pro-choicers are upset that Planned Parenthood Federation of America didn't do more to fight for this being available to preteens and the like, and they're wondering if maybe there isn't some, underlying motivation that by not making it available over the counter to younger women, that they make it more likely that people will procure their services at a markup at Planned Parenthood. So I just thought it was funny that in this year of crony capitalism that you'd even get a crony capitalism charge on Sebelius's Plan B decision. But I mean, Planned Parenthood did come out afterwards and say we would really like to meet with Kathleen Sebelius. Mm-hmm. But some people think that they didn't try hard enough leading up to the fight. Yeah,
I don't think they've been on my email then. I'm on their mailing list. And the emails I've gotten from Planned Parenthood.
Yeah, I mean, normally they actually will. They'll send out notes saying, you need to call this person or do this thing. And I don't know. I haven't actually looked into it, but I thought that was an interesting charge. Of course, the other thing I was just thinking of was Kathleen Sebelius is the one who said, "This is war," at that pro-choice event earlier this year, right? She's like, we are in a war with pro-lifers. So everyone, I think part of the disappointment might be that they thought, well, here we have a really good general in the war, against pro-lifers or something. And then she totally caved. And so I think that might be.
Yeah, well, I think actually the disappointment for this decision is rooted in this HHS rule about contraception coverage in health reform that we're still waiting for the final ruling on.
Right.
That has gotten folks riled up all throughout the fall, even though, I think what gets lost in the abortion rights argument about all of this is that health reform represents the largest expansion of contraception coverage ever in the U.S. It's being, through being covered in health plans. That's covering something like 25 million women. The fight over whether it should also cover women who work for, say, Catholic employers is a fight over whether to extend it to, say, an additional million women. So it's kind of losing the point in the whole argument, I think, to say, that the Obama administration has let down the abortion rights side when they got this enormous victory.
Well, I'm very curious to see how this one goes. This is such a huge issue to require Catholic employers to provide services in their insurance or to cover through their insurance things that they vehemently oppose, and have for thousands of years, is just kind of a shocking expansion there. And I think that at first it was sort of a Catholic issue, and now all sorts of religious people are getting on board saying this seems like a violation of conscience protection to force a Catholic organization to provide for sterilizations, abortions. This is extremely different than than what you would have expected even a couple of years ago. And I'm curious if they're actually going to follow through with this. What do you think?
Well, it's not requiring them to cover abortions. It's requiring,
but it's requiring them to cover things that at times can work as chemical abortions, which is something that everyone knows the Catholic Church opposes.
Yes.
I mean, that's, but also just sterilizations and contraception, also things that Catholic teaching opposes. So
they do. But there are a few things going on here. I think nobody comes out well in this particular situation. The Obama administration just messed up the way it handled it. They have been, I think, so focused on viewing the Catholic bishops as opponents that they haven't recognized that even their own Catholic allies on this stuff are upset. The abortion rights groups have also made this a war against the bishops, missing the fact that this is a matter of religious freedom, and that you've got all sorts of moderate Catholics who are up in arms. But I would also say that Catholics who are upset about this are also overlooking the fact that currently a lot of Catholic institutions do cover all of these services in their healthcare plans. The biggest factor for large Catholic institutions, like it is for all large institutions in choosing healthcare plans, has been cost and who gives you the best deal. A place like Georgetown University has been covering birth control for its students and its employees.
We're not going to include Jesuits here, are we? I mean, I figured Jesuits have been doing that since the beginning.
Okay, well, they're not the only Catholic university that does that. So it's kind of selective, but I agree that the problem here is requiring Catholic institutions
right.
to...
and one of the things I thought was interesting, the religious exemption that's provided, you can get a religious exemption, but one of the things is that you can't serve people who aren't co-religionists. So it's a religious exemption that wouldn't even cover Jesus himself, since Jesus did not have a religious test for who he would help out. And I just think this is the most poorly constructed religious exemption you could find.
Yeah, that's a favorite argument of the Catholic bishop's spokeswoman. It's not the exemption. It was one of the proposed exemptions. There were two proposed exemptions, one that gets conveniently overlooked. And the question on the table for the administration is they have three choices. They can include no religious exemption, which is what abortion rights supporters are pushing for. They can include the kind of limited exemption that's gotten most of the attention, or they can include the broader one, which is the one that's normally used by the IRS to determine who is a religious institution for tax-exempt purposes. And that is the one that reportedly they were leaning towards until this became a big, huge, hairy deal. And now it is much more of a political decision than it was going to be before, just kind of determined on religious liberty grounds that I think the administration overlooked in the original announcement of their proposal. Mm-hmm. But, you know, we'll wait to see what that is. I have a feeling it's going to be announced on Christmas Eve or something when nobody's paying attention.
Right. The dump. Okay, well, let's move on to the excitement that is the GOP nominating process. So
we are less than a month away from Iowa.
I kind of, as someone who's always wanted a brokered convention in my lifetime, I'm still rooting for that. I think that GOP this year might be our best chance we've had in a long in a long while. So I love watching different people sort of rise and fall, and the problems and merits of each candidate. But apparently Gingrich is doing quite well right now, for the moment. So I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what is contributing to Gingrich's rise among GOP primary voters.
Yeah, in the past couple of weeks, I've been wondering whether I need to kind of write a I was wrong post for our blog, since for the last at least year I've been insisting that this guy is not actually campaigning, that he's out there on an extended book tour. And after much thought, I don't actually feel guilty. I think this took Newt by surprise as much as it did anybody else. I think it's been a matter of good timing and the fact that he does pretty well in debates. And there have just been so darn many debates that I think that's how most voters have experienced the candidates this time around. It's actually really interesting to compare this to 2008 and see how relatively little time these guys have been spending in the major early primary states.
Right.
They're in Iowa, but are they blanketing Iowa like the candidates were in 2008? Not really. It'd be hard to do it if you have to fly out every 3 days for a different debate in a different location. So I think that really has shaped this particular nominating process in a way that we haven't seen in the past. But I still find it just ridiculous that Newt Gingrich is considered the front runner. Maybe I am the only person who remembers the 1990s, but that guy was the least popular person on earth for much of the 90s.
Well, I loved Peggy Noonan's take on this, which is that it's all true about Newt. Like, everything you hear that's good about Newt, it's true. Everything that you hear that's awful about Newt, that's true too. It's just, he has a lot of strengths, he has a lot of weaknesses, and certainly he has benefited mightily from Mitt Romney's complete inability to capture any passion or excitement from primary voters. But I'm wondering if you think there's any religion angle here. Like, does religion play a role in Gingrich's success or Romney's lack of success or any of the other candidates?
I get the sense that it plays some role. In other words, I think it's a necessary but not sufficient condition for a lot of social conservative voters. But they, like everybody else, are concerned about the economy this year. And there, I'm not sure really how you do decide between the candidates in the field. I think for Romney, we just don't know yet what effect his religion is going to have. I've written about this a couple times this year that, he was the front runner for much of this campaign up until, a month or so ago. But it was almost by default because he never really broke the 25% threshold. And he never broke that in 2007 or 2008 either. It could be just that he's got a base of support that's 25% of the Republican primary electorate, and he can't go above that, in which case, more power to whoever's left over, and that could well be Gingrich. That said, there have been a lot of articles in the past couple of weeks trying to explain Gingrich's appeal to evangelicals, and I think that's all absurd, because he has, no question, very shrewdly identified religious freedom for Christians as his issue in the past 5-6 years, and gone on out and made documentaries and written several books and become one of the leaders last year in the fight against building an Islamic Center in Lower Manhattan. So that's definitely been something that I think could heighten his appeal to evangelicals. But the idea that Newt has some kind of conversion story that is what social conservative voters are looking for, kind of like George Bush's conversion story, I think is just ridiculous.
I think
he converted to Catholicism, but it's not a come to Jesus story.
I do think it's helpful though for voters. Like, people really do have a problem with his immorality, And I think that they do find it helpful that they have something that they can kind of explain away why they think he'll be more moral this time than he has been in the past. I find it just fascinating that if Romney or Gingrich get the nomination, that'll be the first time the Republicans have nominated a Mormon or a Catholic. I think.
Yeah.
But I do think that evangelicals wish they had a candidate who was more like them, who was viable. And I think that does play a role in why Romney hasn't lit up the base. I don't think that religion doesn't play a role in that, but I think so does a bunch of other stuff, like his position on social issues in general, or the way that he plans to tinker with the economy. None of that really excites evangelicals or that part of the party. But
that's the thing. Romney is a horrible candidate to test the question of whether Mormonism is a problem for social conservative Republican voters. There are just so many other reasons for them to not like Romney. In particular, I think his just blithely tossing out a $10,000 bet to Rick Perry in the last debate, that should be his moment, like George H.W. Bush's looking at his watch in the 92 debates. I think that should be it for him, just because reveals
so bad for him. I'm one of those people who says I will bet you $1 million all the time, and I don't gamble. I don't even believe in.
But that even would have been better if he said, like, I bet you $1 million, I bet you $1 trillion.
See, and I bet I would assume that he wanted to say $1 million, but thought that would sound too much like a Bain Capital, CEO. So he went with the 10,000. I do find it kind of funny that he accidentally slipped into that, and also that Rick Perry had that perfect, like, I'm not a gambling man response.
Yeah.
It's funny. So, okay, about Rick Perry, though, I actually think, and I'm a horrible prognosticator of all things, but I do think Rick Perry might see a little surge here in Iowa. So I'm curious what you think of his advertising campaign there.
Well, I'm kind of appalled by his advertising campaign, but I agree that I think it could work to some extent in reminding people that he's still in the race, and be a kind of solid down the line social conservative candidate. On the appalled side, I just find it interesting in his ads, particularly the one that has been called out mostly for the focus on him mentioning gays in the military. But to me, the more disturbing part of it was just blithely throwing out facts like children can't celebrate Christmas in public schools, and Obama is waging a war against religion in general. Not a war against Christmas, but a war against all religion. I know these are campaign ads, and campaign ads are not known for being thoroughgoing, but that to me shows a willingness to just kind of not wade into the culture war, but just storm in guns blazing. And maybe it works for him.
I think that there is a huge disconnect here, and so many people I talk to who have children in public schools. I don't have children in public schools, but they talk about this issue of how Christmas is not celebrated. So you'll have like a given school where 85-90% of the people are Christian, and then they do their winter program, and the one thing that doesn't get mentioned is Christmas. They have like Diwali songs and totally seasonally inappropriate Ramadan mentions, and Hanukkah song, and the one thing that doesn't get mentioned is Christmas. Now, this is why I send my kids to Lutheran school, so we can celebrate Christmas and Advent, the season we're in now, in style. But this does anger a lot of people, and they feel like tolerance is going one way, and that things are just almost being silly in the way that you're not allowed to talk about Christmas in schools or whatnot. And my parents just went to two of my nieces' Christmas program, winter program, and reported back that there was no mention of Christmas. This was in Colorado, really red area that they're in, and they just thought it was weird. And my parents are also Lutheran. They don't really need religion in the schools. They just thought it was weird to see all this focus on other holidays and not on Christmas. So I think that people err when they don't realize what Rick Perry is talking about. And the other point I'd mention is that when that school prayer decision came down, when was that? Like the late 60s, I think?
Mid-60s, yeah.
I read once that got more mail from people to Congress than any issue, including civil rights issue around that time. People really care. I'm also someone who does not believe in prayer in school. I mean, I believe in prayer, again, in our Lutheran school, which is why I send our children to Lutheran school, but I don't believe in prayer in public school. But man, do people support that issue. And that is something that really bothers people. And I read this PolitiFact fact check, which was like, no, Rick Perry is completely wrong. You can celebrate Christmas as much as you want and pray whenever you want in school. I was like, it was a silly fact check. Since, of course, you can't, you don't do corporate prayer in school. You can pray quietly or on your own individually whenever you want, of course. But you don't have corporate prayer in schools. Neither should you, I would add. But the whole fact check was silly to not get what he's saying there. And I think actually his other ad where he's saying something like, I will just say it as it is instead of pretend that things are different than they are, sort of works well with that ad, because everyone knows there is this tension or problems with navigating tolerance and whether tolerance works as a one-way or two-way street. And so when he just says it in his Rick Perry, I'm going to say it kind of style, then I think that might appeal to voters who are just sick of being told that it's raining when someone is pissing on their shoes or whatever. So, as the Iowans say. So I think that it'll be interesting to see if he gains any traction there or not, or if just his first impression with voters was so craptastic that he will never be able to recover from that.
Yeah, I think you're right. It comes down to whether voters feel that they need somebody more like them. That's usually the preference of many social conservative voters, but it doesn't end up being what moves them at the end. Certainly you could say that John McCain was not going to be the candidate who set social conservatives' hearts on fire in 2008. And George Bush wasn't even the initial favorite in 2000. And obviously somebody like Bob Dole wasn't the favorite. This comes down to a matter of political pragmatism, I think, often, and which candidate they can abide. And it may be that Mitt Romney is not that candidate, so whoever looks strong near the end is the one they go with. And whether that's Newt Gingrich or Rick Perry, I think both of them are going to be in it for a little while. I would also love to see a brokered convention at some point as a political geek. But I see this thing getting wrapped up actually fairly quickly.
No. Boo. I keep threatening that I'm going to go occupy Mitch Daniels' lawn. I think I could get like a sizable group of people to go do this with me, and we could get him to reconsider. But the only other thing I wanted to mention on the Republican candidates right now is, have you noticed that Mitt Romney has started talking about his Mormonism again after literally a 4-year hiatus?
Mm-hmm.
I think that's very interesting that he realizes he's out of touch, and sort of the only way you can get people to feel any affinity for you is to open up and be more personal. And maybe there's sort of a limit. Maybe he's maxed out his discussions of his family. And so he started telling stories that aren't even in his book about his Mormon missionary experience. Mm-hmm. He's, he was really loath to get into this for many years. And I don't know, I'm just interested. I don't really know what it will do. But, and the other thing on that note is, of course, Mormons don't support gambling. So I loved that someone who put out an ad yesterday taking up Romney on his bet was my favorite Mormon, John Huntsman. And so I thought it was great that we had like 2 Mormons wagering $10,000 on an issue. But John Huntsman is such a jack Mormon anyway that he probably does gamble.
Yeah.
He's not a he's not the best Mormon of the bunch, but
Yeah, it was funny. I noticed on Twitter a couple days ago, because I love following the John Huntsman girls on Twitter.
You too.
They had some comment about going to get coffee, and somebody said, "Wait, don't you guys, aren't you not allowed to drink coffee?"
Well, see, I grew up out west, and we have tons of Mormons out there. I even am related to some of them, and my in-laws are Mormon. And there's a wide variety of practice among the LDS. And, like, some of the most pure living people I've known are Mormon. Sometimes the worst things I ever learned came from Mormons. And I think it's, of course, they're going to be Mormons for drinking. And, like, the Huntsman girls also were, I think they took pictures of themselves drinking wine or referenced it, and coffee and all that. But they still identify as LDS. And I think it's probably helpful for people to realize there's a wide variety of practice there, just as there is among Catholics and whatnot. But I really like the Huntsman girls. I loved their sexy back commercial. I was the only person in America who liked that, apparently. But anyway,
you weren't
okay,
creeped out by the idea that they were bringing sexy back in the form of their father.
Not at all. And I love Justin Timberlake, so he can do no wrong. But okay, so on the other side of the aisle, we should probably mention something about Democrats and religion here. I noticed that the Obamas, who dress so well, if I can say, like, those girls really look put together in a way that I can never get my girls to look put together. They walked across the park to church on Sunday, which is something do they do that often, or what's the deal there?
Well, I have to throw in the observation that Malia, oh my gosh, she's almost as tall as her mom now. That girl is just shot up. So good for her. She's just looking really quite grown up. And yes, I did envy their stylish little crew cut outfits. They look far more together than any family I normally encounter going to church. But yes, they did walk across the park, even though it was a very chilly Sunday. And that was, I believe, their first Christmas or church visit since Easter, although there's been one non-holiday visit this year. It continues to, I think, be a factor in why a fair number of folks can't identify Obama's religion. In fact, one of the poll numbers that always jumps out at me is the percentage of African Americans who aren't sure that Obama is Christian. And my theory has been for a while that it's because they don't see him going to church every Sunday. And they assume if you're a black man and you're Christian, you're going to black church every week. And that's just not something they associate with his image. At this point, I should probably stop harping on it and maybe give some credit to the Obamas for sticking to their guns and deciding this just wasn't something they were going to do. And whether it really is that they want their private time or whether there are other reasons for not going to church. The politically easy thing to do would have been to just pick a church in D.C. and go every week and insulate him from attacks that way. But I find it really interesting that they're just kind of heading out to the St. John's Episcopal Church, which is kind of the official church that presidents visit.
Presidents, right?
And, in Hawaii, they rarely go to church for Christmas Eve or this year, Christmas is on Sunday. I'm, betting they don't go out for Christmas Day services this year. Okay,
but they do worship at Camp David frequently, and they have talked about that. They have their personal chaplain there, basically.
Mm-hmm. And
I
Bush
think
did.
It's also
because Bush didn't really attend church in D.C. either. Camp David was his main place of worship.
I wish people would realize just how impossible it is to find a church home and worship there regularly when you're president. I mean, when was Bill Clinton probably did it better than any of the last 5 presidents or so.
He did, and I actually went to Foundry for several of the years when the Clintons were going there, and it was not really a big deal. It took us an extra 5 minutes to get through the metal detectors, and they would come in during the first hymn and not really make a big deal of it. So it can be easier than I think Ronald Reagan made it out to be when that was his excuse for why he didn't go to church. I do acknowledge that for the Obamas, it's very different in D.C. People start lining up at 4 a.m.
Yeah, there's an addition, exactly, that there's that, and then there's an additional issue, which is that there are larger political problems now with joining a church. So I was reading how a reporter described the sermon that happened at St. John's. Wait, is that St. John's, the church that the Obamas visited?
Yeah.
And I was wondering how closely it actually hewed to what was actually said. Because I, as someone who worships regularly, even among my friends after a given sermon when we're discussing it, we might pull totally different things from it, or we might disagree on exactly what was said on a particular point. And you take reporters who might be more like political reporters or might not be familiar with a given religious tradition. Are they even going to get it right? Are they just waiting to hear the pastor say one thing that they can quote out of context and then explode it out? I mean, there are lines in each week of my Lutheran pastor's sermon that could be taken out of context and used to harm any member, more high profile member that we have. And I just think that after the Obamas experience with Jeremiah Wright, not to defend, all of what happened there, they're understandably gun shy about joining a church where they have no control, and neither should they, of what the pastor is saying, but they're held completely responsible for it. So I think that in many ways, the way the media treats this religious participation is just horrible for any president who wants to have a worship life as part of a community. It really makes me sad, actually, that we don't take more care in how we discuss what's happening in a congregation that the president visits, or what level of involvement they seek to have. And I wouldn't be surprised if we never see a non-Catholic president participating in a congregational life from here on out.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, that this may well be far less about the Obamas themselves and more setting what I agree with you is kind of a sad precedent for presidents not being able to have a worship life while they're in the White House. Before he was inaugurated, I called around for just a fun, trivial story, and asked people for suggestions of where they would recommend the Obamas look into worshiping in D.C. And actually, the best suggestion I heard was that they go to one of the local military bases, where there wouldn't be a problem with security. They could say they were worshiping with the troops, so who's going to criticize them for that? The chaplains are rotated and appointed, so it's not like they could ever have any control over who the pastor is giving the sermon. And they wouldn't have, gawkers. They could worship in peace. And there's lots of kids on bases, so the girls could go to Sunday school. That may not have ended up to be their thing. But that is probably the one option left open to future presidents.
That is a great idea. Yeah, good one. I like it. Okay, so since we're talking about Christian worship and whatnot, you had a rather interesting piece in USA Today recently talking about the season that we're in. Can you explain what your argument was?
Yes. I was thinking of this when you were discussing the school winter musicals, because my argument is that as a practicing Christian who wants to celebrate Christmas, the religious holiday, I think we should take Christ out of Christmas. We could just seed Christmas as a completely cultural festival, because things like Santa Claus and snowmen and wreaths and all of that, none of that has any Christian meaning. Many of the items have been associated with Christmas going back hundreds of years. But that's because, if we get into the whole history of this, Christmas had to be kind of incorporated into existing festivals in ancient Rome and in some northern cultures that existed around midwinter. in order to get the locals to kind of accept the idea of celebrating the birth of Christ. And over the years, it's always been a struggle between the cultural celebration and the religious celebration. In fact, I was surprised when I started looking into this that the religious celebration has almost never taken precedence. So this isn't a new situation we're in right now. But I would love to see an end to the Christmas wars. I would love to see an end to religious minorities feeling guilty about participating in anything that kind of has the sheen of Christmas. Because again, I don't see anything Christian about singing Deck the Halls or, Christmas movies that are all about the cultural celebration of Christmas. I think we all like the idea of giving each other gifts. It's nice to have a time of year when people are at least pretending to be nice to each other and talking about the meaning of the season being being selfless and thinking of others and, valuing the family. I think those are all awesome, completely secular things that we should be able to have everybody involved with, regardless of their religious affiliation. But I would like to stop feeling resentful that my religious celebration of the birth of Christ gets completely co-opted by this cultural celebration that leaves me exhausted on Christmas morning and in no mood to actually go to church.
Interesting. Yeah, well, it reminds me of a sermon I read from a pastor where he was making fun of people for caring so much about the war on Christmas. And he was like, give me a break. I'd like a war on Ascension, because then maybe you guys would show up for Ascension services. Like you seem to care so much about Christmas. I believe that sermon title was Keeping the Mass in Christmas, which I also like, since there are all these evangelicals that are not even going to be having church on Christmas Day because they do their Christmas Eve services, right. And so they aren't even going to be worshiping on Sunday. So it's kind of hard to take those Christmas wars seriously when you're not going to church. Or as I'm in Advent right now, as I assume you are. So it's kind of funny that we talk about the season leading up to the first day of Christmas as being Christmas. And then once that Christmas season starts, people have moved on. They don't want to sing any carols or hymns, which is my own personal feeling about the war on Christmas, that it's really a war on Advent.
Yeah, that's true.
But
it's true.
Yeah, well, interesting. I mean, I think that there are certainly the celebrations at home versus the celebrations at church, but certainly also most people in this country are Christian and celebrate Christmas as a religious holiday, even if it's hard to see that they're doing that through all of their gift buying and partying in the month of December. Or maybe I'm wrong. Maybe they're not actually aware of the religious connotations. After my week away,
I don't know. I think that for many people, Christmas Eve services are again more of a part of the cultural celebration of Christmas. I mean, there's no question that it's substantively religious.
You realize if those people weren't there, your church would be empty. We'd have just empty churches if the cultural ties weren't so strong here.
Yes. Well, and conversely, if those folks were there for the religious meaning of it, then our churches would be bursting at the seams every Sunday, and they are largely not.
I just want to mention one thing from your article. Not that you said anything contradicting this, but a lot of people think that December 25th was chosen arbitrarily as the date to celebrate Christ's birth, and that's actually not true. It's a wrongly chosen date, but the reasoning actually goes back, an incredibly long time ago, back to just the first couple centuries after Christ's death. And there was a belief at the time that if you were a prophet, that you were conceived and your conception and your death date were the same date. It's called integral age. So they believed that since Jesus died around Passover of that given year, that he must have been conceived on that date, which works out. I mean, we've had many calendar changes since then and whatnot. Works out to roughly March 25th. Add your 9 months, voila, right? Get December 25th. So people frequently mistakenly think it was just a co-option of a different holiday, but actually was chosen on its own rights there.
Interesting. I did know that they had focused mostly in the first few centuries on the death dates of prophets, and therefore it made much more sense to celebrate Easter than it did Christmas until folks started to, as you say, figure out when that birth date might have been.
Right, and even then, when they chose that date, it was not a big holiday. Like Epiphany was the big holiday for the non-death celebration, or resurrection celebration.
Which is why we keep our nativity scene out through January 6th, so I can still keep moving the little wise men closer and closer to the manger.
They're making their way through.
I love that part.
Great. Well, thank you so much. This has been wonderful, and I hope you have a blessed rest of your Advent. And we will
Same to you.
Talk again later.
All right. Take care, Molly.
Okay. Bye.
All right. Bye.